Yeah, is there such a thing as human nature? Or are the groups or the people who deny the possibility of such a thing, which includes a great many Marxists, correct in denying that there's any such thing as human nature?
Well, either there is such a thing as human nature, or humans are angels from another planet or another universe. I mean, any organism that exists in the organic world has a nature. That's what distinguishes it from other organisms. So we're different from insects, we're different from apes, and so on and so forth. And that can either be because we're like other organisms and we have some kind of a nature, or it's because maybe God implanted us in the world or something like that. Those are the two options. Now, you're absolutely right about Marx. People call themselves Marxists. In fact, even well-known Marxists like Gramsci say that there's no nature, human nature, there's just history. If you can find a couple of phrases like that in Marx. They can't have meant what they said. What they probably meant was human nature can take many different exemplifications depending on circumstances, which is of course true. The same is true of insects. But this has become a kind of a slogan. It's considered sort of it's considered that if you, on the left, or what's called the left, that if you deny that there's any human nature, you're in favor of change. If you say there is a human nature, you got to be reactionary, because you're saying, people have to be rotten and have slaves and so on. There's nothing like that. In fact, if you take a look at Marx, who they pay fealty to, he was a dedicated believer in human nature. I mean, in fact, he took most of his ideas right out of the Enlightenment and the Romantic period where he lived. And he carried them over. That's his concept of alienation, for example, and somehow your fundamental nature is a need for creative work under your own control. If it's dominated by others, you get alienated labor. The whole story comes out of that. It's based on a conception of human nature. Is there any evidence for it? Well, let's take the real study. I mean, let's assume we're not angels. Okay, we're organisms. So therefore, there is human nature. Okay, then we try to discover what it is. Well, we do it the way we discover what bee nature is. It's much harder. We're much more complicated organisms. And unlike other organisms, we can't do direct experiments. But if you want to study the parts of human nature that have to do with the issues that matter in human affairs, you can't do anything much in the way of comparative evidence because humans are just different. There isn't much in the way of comparative evidence. Some, but it's pretty thin. And what there is, at an evolutionary distance of 12, 15 million years. It's a long time. Other animals have changed and we've changed. So you just don't get much. I mean, there's some comparative evidence, but not much. Direct experimental evidence, yes, there's some in some areas. Like, take, say, language, where I work. There's quite a lot of evidence there, and that it's a unique human property. There's nothing remotely like it in the animal world, as far as we know. But you can learn a lot about it, because it's kind of isolated, and you can separate it from other things. Actually, many of the questions you'd like to ask about language are beyond experiment, the traditional questions. Like, for example, how you and I are doing what we're now doing. How are we able to produce freely new expressions that have maybe new ideas that have never been expressed, and if you say it, I understand it, and so on and so forth. What's sometimes called the creative aspect of language use, which was a big topic, and in the tradition. I mean, Descartes, Rousseau, Humboldt, others, but we don't know. We can't study that. We can study the mechanisms that enter into it, but not much about the. As soon as you get to choice and decision and so on, you're kind of at sea. But there are a lot of topics you can study. There are many that are beyond what we know how to study, but there's got to be a nature. Otherwise, we're kind of like either we're angels or kind of like amoebas. Anything that happens to us just shapes us, and we become some shapeless form.
Otherwise, a baby could grow up to be a penguin.
Yeah, something. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, there's a huge debate about whether there's an innate language faculty. Well, I mean, the answer to that is so trivial that you have to wonder who's asking the question. I mean, like, if, say, my granddaughter and her pet, a chimp or songbird or whatever, have exactly the same data, how come my granddaughter picks out of the data something that's language related, reflexively, of course, and then again reflexively ends up doing what you and I are doing, whereas the other animals don't even take the first step. Well, it's either a miracle or she's got a language faculty. There's no other option. But there's a huge debate about that, even among people called scientists. People are extremely rational about themselves for some reason. But yes, there has to be a human nature. If there wasn't, it's just stuff. It's inconceivable, and we can try to find out what it is. Well, on issues that really matter to us, the sciences don't tell us very much. I'll tell you a little. So, for example, why are people, say, altruistic? Why do you help others? Okay, there's some evidence from biology. Most of it just sort of gives some basis for what you know anyway. So people tend to be more caring for their children than for their cousins, let's say. Okay, you can give a story about kin selection, the genes that get proliferated and so on. It tells you something. It doesn't tell you why people on Cape Cod go into icy waters and storms to try to rescue stranded dolphins. No kin relation, but they do it, And it doesn't tell you why they spend huge effort in doing that, but don't care about a kid starving across the street, They don't tell you why you take care of your stepchildren, where they're stepchildren. So yeah, it tells you something. And there are there's one category, reciprocal altruism, worked on by Robert Trivers, a very good biologist, which actually has some interesting results. You help somebody else, they help you, so on. Most things you just have to rely on what we call intuition, meaning introspection, experience, evidence of history, whatever they may be. And you can get some, not vacuous speculations about what human beings are like.
There are people who will respond to the idea of justice, equity, fairness, people controlling their own lives, and they'll say, oh yeah, it sounds nice, but human nature precludes it. Human nature is such that, and I'm talking about, caring people who will just say, yeah, of course I'd like to live in a better world like that, but it's like asking a tree to fly. It's not possible, because there is a human nature, and human nature is such that it precludes the possibility of that kind of situation and yields instead what we see all around us and what we've seen through history. How would you try to talk to counter, to address that kind of view, which is very widespread?
Well, two ways. First, the way you try to evaluate any factual statement. You made a factual claim. Back it up. Do you have scientific basis for it? Do you have evidence for it? Well,
they're going to say, my evidence is all over. I have a history of, that's what they're going to say. I have a history of suffering and conflict and
you have a history
denial,
of benevolence and dedication to improving things. History tells you all kinds of things. It doesn't tell you what you want. The same history can tell you the opposite if you want. So you're picking out of history certain features which happen to have an interesting consequence. They prevent you from doing anything. They're very self-serving. If nothing can be changed, then it's fine if you just want to be Ayn Rand or something. But you have no evidence for it, because if you take a look at history, you just as well find the opposite. You can show in history that Kropotkin was right in saying that mutual aid is a factor in evolution. Okay, it's as good as the evidence to the contrary. So you take the range of history and experience and so on, and you can pick out something that will justify you in just looking out for number one, or you can take something that would justify you in devoting yourself to the welfare of others. It's your choice, but you can't claim any argument from history. In fact, if you really take arguments from history seriously, we could argue about how seriously you should do it, but there is something noticeable. There is a tendency throughout history towards more and more commitment to justice, equity, and freedom. And you see it pretty clearly And we even see it in our own lifetimes. Like take, say, women's rights, rights of minorities, concern over future generations, the environmentalist movement. That was very limited 40 or 50 years ago. Now it's quite broad. You go back further, say, the right to vote, right to associate, right of freedom of speech, by and large, rights, there has been there's regression, a lot of horrible things, but one pretty noticeable tendency in history is towards more freedom and justice and equity.